The Potomac River has always been an obstacle, but not a barrier, to travel between Northern Virginia and Montgomery County. Before there were bridges, Native Americans and early settlers had to either walk or take a boat. Today, despite the bridges that we've built, crossing the Potomac remains a challenge. It's assumed that ferries in the form of poled rafts were used during colonial times. Records indicate that the legislature of Virginia established Edwards Ferry in 1791. From a commercial and social standpoint, crossing the Potomac was important to residents on both shores. During the Civil War, however, the ability to traverse this body of water became a matter of national security. Charles Jacobs has spent more than 30 years researching and writing about Civil War activity in Montgomery County. He says that the Potomac River figured prominently in that war.
It was just about the border between the North and the South rather than the Mason-Dixon line or anything else. But it was a barrier for any possible Confederate attempt to capture the capital or invade Maryland. But it was there. It was something that both forces had to account for.
The C&O Canal, which runs alongside the Potomac, was also at risk. Back then, small communities had developed around the locks, the remnants of which we still see today. There were grain warehouses, stores, and post offices. During the Civil War, commerce along the canal was very important to the Union Army.
The Confederates made every attempt they could anytime they were in the area to either damage or destroy the canal. As early as 1861, General Robert E. Lee sent orders to Confederate General Hunton, who was in charge right across the river here, to make every attempt he could to destroy the canal, destroy commerce on the canal, destroy the canal itself, and particularly to destroy the canal aqueduct over the Monocacy River, which was attempted several times but never succeeded.
In order to protect the canal, as well as the Maryland border, Union troops camped throughout this area of western Montgomery County.
Union forces wanted to camp all over, particularly Montgomery County, to prevent a lot of crossings of the Potomac by either Marylanders going into Virginia or Virginians coming into Maryland, or the possibility of Union troops of Confederate troops crossing the river to surround Washington, D.C., which would cut off the capital of the United States from the northern states.
Despite the effort to protect this border, many significant troop crossings did occur.
Throughout the war, there were many crossings within Montgomery County of the Potomac River, starting up around the Monocacy. The first ford down from there was White's Ford, not to be confused with White's Ferry of today. That had three major crossings by the Confederate Army. During the Antietam campaign, about 35,000 troops of General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia crossed at White's Ford and proceeded up toward the Frederick area. 2 months later, after the Battle of Antietam, Jeb Stuart made his second ride around the Union Army and crossed back into Virginia at White's Ford. In 1864, Jubal Early, after his invasion of Maryland and his attempt to capture Washington, D.C., crossed back at White's Ford with about 10,000 troops. And he was followed several days later by the pursuing Union Army, who crossed about 10,000 troops there at that point. Further on down was White's Ferry, which is the name of today. In those days, it was Conrad's Ferry, which hasn't existed since 1700 and so forth. Further on down is where we are now, Edwards Ferry, which was a ferry in operation in the 1700s. Then it was just a ferry not controlled by cable or rope or anything else, but a skiff, which would be poled back and forth. Further on down was where Muddy Branch empties into the Potomac, and Mosby would invade that periodically to attack Union camps. Colonel Lige White of the 35th Virginia, who was a Marylander, would also use that as well as White's Ford and other fords to come in, make short-term attacks, and then go back by another ford to evade forces.
For the most part, these troops walked or rode horses across. But in 1863, right here at Edwards Ferry, something very different was tried.
Prior to the Battle of Antietam, when Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia was up in Frederick area and on up in toward Pennsylvania, the Union Army, of course, was charged with first destroying that army, which they couldn't do, but also protecting Washington and Baltimore. They sent massive troops up toward the Potomac River, and at this particular point, Union engineers bought pontoon boats to construct a pontoon bridge across here. They brought them up the canal, put them into the canal at the lock just below us.
These pontoon boats were placed side to side, similar to what you see here, creating two bridges 1,400 feet across this part of the Potomac.
Approximately 97,000 troops took 3 days and nights to cross here. In addition to the 97,000 troops, there were about 35,000 mules and horses that came along with the Army for the cavalry, for the infantry, and for the artillery. And it did take 3 full days for all those troops to cross and move up toward Gettysburg and the Pennsylvania.
Charles Jacobs is filled with Civil War stories like these, bringing to life events that happened right here in our own backyard.